the 10th of September, 1944. Dawn had barely broken, and a thick fog still clawed at the treetops of the Whisper Woods. It was cold, a damp chill that felt less like autumn and more like a promise of the grave. The air was a strange cocktail of scents: wet pine, burnt rubber, and something else: iron. The kind of morning where even the silence felt deafening. Sergeant Jack Thorne pressed himself into the mud of a shallow foxhole, dug right into the forest's sodden earth. His uniform was soaked through from an overnight downpour. His fingers trembled, not just from the cold, but from a heavy, sticky fear. He squinted into the milky haze and saw them, moving shadows. Not birds, not deer, tanks, German tigers. Their engines rumbled in the distance like waking beasts of steel, and they were rolling straight for him. Just yesterday, Jack and his squad had held this very ridge. Hold at all costs, they'd been told. A vital supply road was at their backs. But last night, everything changed. General Robert Kane, known behind his back as Mad Dog Kane, had issued a full retreat. No explanation, no rousing speech, just a single, dry transmission. Fall back to position 722. Abandon the forward line. Jack had stared at his radio man, bewildered. "He wants us to... what?" The man just nodded. It wasn't a request. It was an order. And now, in the pre-dawn gloom, Jack's squad lay hidden miles to the west, watching the Germans crawl over the very positions they had just abandoned. He whispered, mostly to himself, "We're not retreating. We're just giving up ground." The soldier next to him muttered, "We're running. That's what this is. Just running." But Jack wasn't so sure. There was something in Kane's silence, not panic, not fear. It was like he knew something no one else did. Still, Jack didn't get it. Not yet. Back in the rear, under the red glow of a command lamp, General Kane was bent over a map. His finger traced the enemy's likely path, the roads they would take, the choke points they would enter, the forest corridors that narrowed like a funnel. Then, without looking up, he threw a line to his aide. "They think we're running. Let them believe it." Out in that foxhole, Jack could hear the distant rumble growing louder. The tanks were closer now. He tightened his grip on his rifle. Somewhere in the canopy, a single bird took flight. And then, silence again. A retreat? No, this was never a retreat. It was a lure. And in less than 24 hours, 3 entire German divisions would walk straight into the jaws of a trap. So cleverly hidden, so precisely timed, they wouldn't see it until it was far too late. The general, nobody trusted, and the hill, nobody wanted. 6 days earlier, the 4th of September, 1944. The Allied front was an unstoppable wave rolling across France. The capital had just been liberated. American and British forces were pushing the Germans back faster than anyone had imagined possible. Morale was sky high. Newspapers across the globe trumpeted the headlines: "Victory in Europe is at hand." But in a dark, crowded field tent near the Belgian border, General Robert Kane was seeing something else entirely. He wasn't smiling at the headlines. He wasn't raising a glass with the others. Instead, he was studying a map spread out on a table, lit only by the flickering flame of an oil lamp. His face was granite. His eyes were locked on a narrow strip of land near the Whisper Woods. "Right here," he said softly. "This is where they'll make their stand." Major James Cole, his operations chief, frowned. "Sir, we've got them on the run. High Command believes they're on the verge of collapse." Kane tapped the map twice. "That's what they want us to think. But Hitler isn't finished. Not by a long shot." He was pointing at Route 9, a narrow road snaking through the Whisper Woods, connecting the cities of Aachen and Bastogne. On paper, it was just a country lane. Militarily, It was a golden artery. If the Germans could hold that corridor, they could delay the Allied advance for weeks, maybe months. 3 German divisions, roughly 30,000 men, were falling back into that area. The official intelligence said they were disorganized, low on fuel, and broken in spirit. But Kane didn't buy it. "They're not retreating," he said in a low voice. "They're gathering into a fist," Cole scoffed. "With what? We shattered their lines in the salient. We annihilated them in the pocket. What have they got left?" Kane's reply was instant. "Enough. Enough to fight. Enough to make us bleed." He ordered an immediate halt to the American advance at the edge of the Whisper Woods and began repositioning his forces. Infantry, light armor, artillery, all of it was pulled from the front and shifted to the hills in the rear. It did not go unnoticed. To most commanders, it looked like madness. To the press, it looked like cowardice. They started calling him Mad Dog Kane again. The name had stuck ever since North Africa, where he'd once held a besieged position for 6 days. No food, no water, and still somehow threw the enemy back. He had always done things his own way. He didn't play by the book. He wrote his own. But this time, even Cole was beginning to doubt. "You're asking us to fall back and give them the initiative," he said. Kane looked at him with a calm, unsettling confidence. "No," he replied. "I'm asking you to help me break them for good." Meanwhile, Sergeant Jack Thorne and his platoon were digging in east of Ironwood Ridge, holding what they thought was a temporary forward position. The woods were quiet, but something felt wrong. No enemy activity, no air reconnaissance, no artillery duels. It was too quiet. Jack, scribbling in his journal, noted, "It feels like we're the only ones left in this war. No shots, no screams, just the birds. It's unnerving." The next morning, the word came down. All forward units were to pull back by nightfall. No reason given. Jack stared at the order. "We're abandoning our high ground?" he asked. His corporal just shrugged. New orders, from the top. As the sun set on the 5th of September, the American line began to bend. Not under pressure, but by design. Trucks rolled out under the cover of darkness. Artillery was repositioned. Defensive trenches were left empty. Campfires were lit and abandoned to create the illusion of presence. And somewhere in the forest depths, a different kind of war was beginning. This wasn't a redeployment. It was stagecraft. And General Kane was betting everything, his reputation, his command, and the lives of his men, that the enemy would do exactly what he expected. He just had to make them believe they were winning, because if they took the bait, he'd have them right where he wanted them. The mad retreat that looked like a defeat. The 6th of September, 1944. Rain lashed the canopy of the Whisper Woods. Mud clung to every boot. The air smelled of wet leaves, diesel, and gun oil. Under a leaden sky, Sergeant Jack Thorne was trudging backward. That's right, backward, down a narrow forest trail, leading his platoon away from the front. No gunfire, no enemy pressure, no pursuit. Just orders. Orders no one understood. They'd been told to abandon Ironwood Ridge, the forested crest they'd spent 2 weeks fortifying, and fall back to Hill 722, a wooded knob 4 kilometers to the west. It was lower ground, less defensible, and farther from the strategic highway they'd been ordered to protect at all costs. Jack muttered to himself, "We're just handing it all to them, like it never mattered." Corporal Evans, a young kid fresh out of Texas, looked over. "Sergeant, are we losing the war?" Jack didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know. In the rear, General Kane's command post was a storm of chaos. Not from battle, but from skepticism. His senior officers were questioning everything. Major Cole spread a map on the table, his voice tight. Sir, with all due respect, the men don't understand what we're doing. The Germans are regrouping, not routing. If we give them the initiative, they're going to push. Kane didn't look up. That's the point, Cole pressed on. You're asking us to abandon high ground. To let them advance and what? Hope they walk into a trap? Kane finally met his eyes. Not hope. Plan. But even as he said it, the weight of the gamble was in his voice. This wasn't just a tactical withdrawal. It was a psychological one. If his own men lost faith, the plan would crumble. If the Germans saw through it, they would strike fast and hard. And if High Command found out what Kane was really up to, he'd be relieved of command before the first shot was fired. He knew it, and he was doing it anyway. By nightfall, the American withdrawal was complete. Trenches were abandoned, supply dumps dismantled, gun pits left empty. The forest fell into an eerie silence. To the Germans watching from a distance, it looked like a total rout. But to the Americans taking up positions on Hill 722, it felt like an agonizing weight. That night, Jack wrote in his journal, "I've never been this scared in my life. Not of being surrounded, not of the shells, but because I have no damn idea what we're doing." Then he added, "And maybe the men giving the orders don't either." The tension was building. Morale was sinking. Rumors started to fly. Some men said Kane had been sacked. Others, that he'd gone mad. A few joked that he was just tired of fighting and wanted to walk back to the capital. But Kane didn't flinch. He visited the gun crews on the ridge, checking camouflage nets, talking to the artillerymen. Every word was measured, every glance calculated. Then, from a dugout on the western slope, he looked out over the valley and murmured, "They'll come through there, thinking we've fled." The trap was nearly set, but the hardest part was convincing everyone else that the madness was just the beginning of the plan. 3 divisions walked in. No one knew it was a kill box. The fog lay over Ironwood Ridge, thick and suffocating like spilled milk. Through the trees, there was no movement. The ground was a churned mess of rot, spent shell casings, and tire tracks. To any German officer with a pair of binoculars, it looked exactly as it was supposed to, a panicked flight. General Ulrich von Richter, commander of the 12th German Steel Corps, surveyed the scene from a mobile command post 10 kilometers east of the ridge. He studied the aerial photos, the intelligence reports, the intercepted radio silence. No American troop movement, no defensive fire, no artillery response, nothing. His aide leaned in. "It appears they've withdrawn completely, General." Von Richter frowned, not because he doubted the report, but because it felt too convenient. "They were digging in here for weeks," he said slowly. "Why leave now?" Still, the opportunity was too tempting to ignore. His orders from on high were simple: halt the Allied advance, regain control of the strategic roads, and hold the Whisper Woods corridor. The American retreat seemed to hand him all 3. He gave the order. By noon, 3 German divisions began to move west: the 12th Steel Division on the left, the 77th Storm Division on the right, and the 101st Rifle Division straight down the middle, over Ironwood Ridge. At first, the advance was smooth. Columns of Tiger tanks snaked through the woods. Soldiers rode in half-tracks, smoking cigarettes, laughing at how easy it was. Some found discarded American rations. Others stumbled upon campfires that were still warm. They believed the Americans had fled in a panic. One German officer wrote in his diary, "The Yanks have turned tail. We are masters of the field once more." But they were wrong. They were being watched. From a ridge hidden by fog and forest canopy, Jack Thorne was lying prone, glued to a pair of field glasses. Beside him, Corporal Evans was silently counting the tanks as they rolled in. 4, 5, 6, he whispered. Jack gave a grim nod. They're entering the Narrows. A few yards behind them, hidden in the brush, an entire line of American artillery crews waited in utter silence. The barrels of a dozen 155mm howitzers were aimed not at the trees, but at a specific bend in the forest road, a spot Kane had circled in red ink 3 days ago. The funnel, the kill box. Major Cole stood behind the gun line, tense, his eyes closed, listening. At 1400 hours exactly, the lead German column crossed into the kill zone. A single, green flare shot into the sky. "Fire!" Cole said, and the forest exploded. The shells screamed down from the ridge. The earth heaved under the German tank treads. Men scrambled for cover. Trees splintered into nothing. Shrapnel turned pine needles into knives. Panic. The Germans tried to reverse, but their path back was suddenly gone. American engineers, working from the far side of the ridge, had felled trees across the narrow trail and mined the retreat routes. A second flare went up. This time, it wasn't for the artillery. It was for the armor. American M18 Hellcat tank destroyers rolled out of camouflaged positions in the woods, hitting the German column from both flanks. Machine guns chattered. Anti-tank rounds tore through the Tiger's hulls. The Germans were trapped, not by chance, but by perfect design. Atop Hill 7. 22. Kane stood calmly, binoculars pressed to his eyes. "They took the bait," he said. In the chaos below, Jack Thorne and his squad were scrambling down the ridge. They hit the German lines, fast, hard, rifles blazing. Jack yelled over the roar. "Hit the lead vehicle! Cut them off!" Grenades flew. A fuel truck went up like a torch. The Germans, stunned and disoriented, were firing wildly in every direction. Jack dragged a wounded soldier behind a tree, blood soaking the man's shirt. "Stay with me," he whispered. "You're not dying here." To the east, the 77th Storm Division walked straight into a second ambush, a false clearing rigged with explosives and booby traps. Command and control lines were cut. Radios were jammed, orders lost. To the west, the 101st Rifle Division tried to flank, but found its own flanks collapsing under the assault of American Rangers, who had infiltrated the woods overnight. This wasn't a firefight anymore. It was a slaughter, and it had all been planned, down to the last detail. The German advance that had begun with such confidence had become a desperate scramble for survival. General von Richter was getting fragmented reports. Casualties mounting, units encircled, tanks disabled. He didn't understand. The Americans weren't supposed to be here, but they were. They had never really left. Back on the ridge, Kane lowered his binoculars. He turned to Cole. "They thought we were running," he said. Cole just nodded, speechless. Kane added, "Now, they're the ones who can't get out." Jack Thorne looked out over the battlefield, covered in mud and blood and soot. He felt a strange feeling in his chest. Not relief, not pride. Something deeper. Understanding. "It wasn't a retreat," he murmured. "It was an invitation. And the hook was set deep. The counterattack begins. Now, we hit them." The 5th of September bled into the 6th. Night fell over the Whisper Woods, like an inky curtain. Smoke still hung in the forest air, mixing with the smell of pine sap and burning rubber. In the distance, fires burned, flickering through the trees like lost souls. Jack Thorne lay in a firing pit, his heart still hammering in his ears. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline that refused to fade. They had survived the initial clash, barely. Nearby, medics worked by flashlight on the wounded. Men were moaning in pain. Others were crying out names. A mother, a wife. Some just stared into space, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. The cost of the bait was starting to show. But this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. At 0300 hours, Kane gave the order that would turn the battle on its head. All units prepare to advance. Full-scale counterattack commences at dawn. Major Cole stared at him. "You're serious?" Kane gave a short, sharp nod. "Now, we hit them." Dawn crept over the treetops. Dew coated the rifle barrels. Engines hummed a low note all across the hills. Jack stood with his squad, the camouflage paint on his face smeared with dried blood and dirt. He tightened the strap on his helmet. He set his jaw. Before them, what was left of the German armored spearhead was pinned down between felled trees, cratered roads, and abandoned vehicles. Their radios were dead. Their officers were killed or scattered. Their confidence was gone. But Kane wasn't content with containment. He wanted annihilation. From the ridge, the American artillery opened up again. This time, it wasn't a defensive barrage. It was direct support for a coordinated push. The shells screamed overhead. Rounds came down like thunder from a god no one was praying to. The forest shook. Jack and his platoon surged forward. No more hiding, no more waiting. Every step was a thunderclap. Every yell was fury. He saw a German machine gun nest ahead, dug into a shallow embankment. The barrel flashed. "Suppressive fire!" he roared. Two of his men opened up with their automatic rifles. Jack, keeping low, scrambled forward with a grenade in his hand and lobbed it into the position. Whoomp. Dirt and bodies flew. The nest went silent. They moved on. In other parts of the forest, ranger units that had been lying in ambush began launching lightning raids on command tents and fuel depots. They would strike and melt back into the trees like ghosts. One group stumbled upon a German artillery position, unmanned, half-loaded, and turned its guns on their former masters. To the west, American tanks smashed through the blockades and advanced in a line, firing point-blank into the trapped vehicles. The German tankers, unable to maneuver, were abandoning their machines and fleeing on foot. Most didn't get far. To the east, the 77th Storm Division, once an elite mobile unit, was now cut off from all supply. Their officers tried to organize a breakout, but Kane had anticipated that too. He had already sent mobile blocking forces, fast, light-armored units that caught them at the edge of the forest and pinned them down in open ground. They never made it to the river. By midday, the smoke hung over the battlefield like a funeral shroud. Jack crouched behind the twisted wreckage of a half-track, reloading his rifle with fingers slick with blood. His ears were ringing from the constant gunfire. His voice was raw. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, but he was alive. His squad pushed on, deeper into a labyrinth of burning trucks and shattered trees. They were finding pockets of Germans surrendering, hands up, uniforms torn, faces hollow with shock. One German soldier, no older than 17, stammered in broken English, "Why? Why did you let us in? Why did you run?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't have to. The real answer was written on the blackened road behind them, in the smoking hulks of the Tigers, and in the long line of white flags now appearing through the haze. By evening, the battle was no longer a contest. It was a rout. American forces had consolidated their positions around Ironwood Ridge and Hill 722. The German units were scattered, leaderless, and surrounded. Radio intercepts showed total confusion at every level. Some officers were demanding orders that never came. Others were requesting permission to retreat, a retreat that was now impossible. 3 full German divisions, 30,000 men, had been reduced to pockets of resistance and crowds of prisoners. And the Americans, they were standing on the very same ground they had seemingly been chased from. General Kane surveyed the battlefield from a captured German observation post. The tails of his greatcoat whipped in the wind. Smoke curled through the trees like a slow-moving tide. He said nothing at first, just watched. Cole came up beside him, holding his helmet under his arm. "You were right," he said. Kane finally spoke. "They thought we were scared. They thought we were broken. They thought we were desperate." He turned slowly and looked Cole straight in the eye. "But desperation is a weapon, Major. You just have to know how to aim it." Jack sat on a crate next to what used to be a German command truck. He opened his journal, his hands still shaking. He wrote, "I thought we were losing. I thought we were running. But we weren't. We were setting the trap. We were becoming the hammer. And when that hammer fell, the sound was deafening. The counterattack was complete, and the myth of the American retreat was shattered forever, crushed from all sides." The collapse of 3 German divisions. By the evening of the 8th of September, the trap hadn't just sprung. It was contracting, like the jaws of a steel vice. The Germans were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive. American forces moved in coordinated layers. The frontline infantry pushed through cleared sectors. Flanking units swung wide on side trails and forest corridors. And ranger teams went deep, cutting off any and all routes of escape. Overhead, P-51 Mustangs screamed through the smoke-filled sky. Their bombs tore holes in the enemy lines like sledgehammers through glass. General Kane watched it all from a mobile command post on the ridge. "They're falling apart," Cole reported, monitoring the intercepted German frequencies. "Some units are begging for permission to withdraw. Others are just asking who's still alive." "They're blind," Kane said simply. "Blind and bleeding out." Down in the forest basin, the 12th German Steel Division was the first to break. Their tanks, once the terror of North Africa and the Eastern Front, were now just burning husks dotting the valley floor. Out of ammunition, their fuel lines cut, and surrounded by infantry, the tankers began abandoning their vehicles and fleeing into the woods. American units rounded them up in dazed, shell-shocked groups, their hands in the air. Sergeant Jack Thorne and his platoon moved through a ravine thick with ash and fog. They advanced with bayonets fixed, not out of necessity, but out of caution. This was where panic bred ambushes. Around one bend, they came upon 5 German soldiers, huddled in a ditch, clinging to each other like schoolboys in a thunderstorm. Jack lowered his weapon. One of them said in a thick accent, "Please, no more." Jack looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Drop your weapons. It's over for you." Farther east, the 77th Storm Division made one last, desperate attempt to break out. It was brave, it was furious, and it was fueled by the last embers of unit cohesion. But it was too late. The American blocking forces had already anticipated their move. 2 companies of infantry, supported by light armor, met them at the southern edge of the woods. What followed was 20 minutes of point-blank combat. Grenades, flamethrowers, bayonet charges. It was brutal, intimate, and primal. When it was over, fewer than 200 stormtroopers were left standing. They laid down their arms in silence, some of them in tears. The final collapse came with the 101st Rifle Division, cut off, out of food, their radios dead. They tried to dig in and hold a position along an old farm track west of the forest, but the Americans weren't waiting anymore. They surrounded them on 3 sides: infantry from the north, rangers from the east, and tanks from the west. Jack's squad was part of the final push. The firefight was brief. A white flag, a tablecloth tied to a broken rifle, was raised from a makeshift bunker. And just like that, it was done. 30,000 German soldiers had marched into the Whisper Woods, expecting to crush a retreating army. Fewer than half of them would walk out. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. By nightfall on the 9th of September, General von Richter was captured trying to escape, disguised as a civilian in a refugee convoy. He was brought under guard to Kane's command post. The 2 men's eyes met. Von Richter, dusty, bloodied, and defeated, spoke first. "You never ran." Kane didn't reply. He didn't have to. The silence was louder than any words. Later that night, Cole approached Kane with a clipboard. "First counts are coming in," he said. "Enemy casualties. We've confirmed over 400 tanks destroyed. Nearly 2,000 vehicles captured or burned. Over 10,000 prisoners. And still counting." Kane let out a long, slow breath. Then he clasped his hands behind his back. "Make sure the men get a hot meal," he said. "And dry socks." Cole almost smiled. "That's your first priority." Kane nodded. "You win battles with strategy. You win wars with soldiers." Somewhere near the old front line, Jack sat by a fire with a mug of coffee, a blanket draped over his shoulders. He stared into the flames, exhausted, trying to process it all. He took out his journal. "They say 3 divisions went into the forest. Only shadows came out. We didn't hold the line. We became the line." The silence after the fight. The price the living pay. A week after the first shell fell in the Whisper Woods, the forest was quiet again, an eerie, humming quiet. It wasn't the silence from before. This silence was thick with smoke and settled deep in the soil. It sat like a heavy weight on the shoulders of every man who walked through the ruins. The ground was littered with the skeletons of war, the twisted hulks of tanks, empty shell casings, charred helmets half buried in the mud. The trees themselves bore the scars, shrapnel buried deep in their trunks. Even the wind seemed to whisper a little slower. Jack Thorne walked the battlefield, his journal in one hand, a cigarette in the other. His uniform was torn, his boots caked in a crust of mud and blood. He moved like a ghost, quietly, carefully, respectfully. Every 20 or 30 paces he passed a body. Some were covered, some were not. He stopped at one of his own. A pale face, eyes still open. Private Evans, the kid from Texas. Jack knelt and gently closed the boy's eyes. He said nothing. He just stayed there for a moment, letting the silence say what words couldn't. At a makeshift aid station, the medics worked without stopping. The wounded came in a steady stream. Shattered limbs, burns, trench foot, shell shock. Men called out for their mothers, their wives, for names Jack didn't know. Others just sat silently, their eyes unfocused, their hands trembling. Victory hadn't spared them. It had only bought them more time. Major Cole stood over a casualty list, his jaw tight. He flipped through page after page, his eyes scanning names he hadn't known, but would now never forget. Kane came up quietly behind him. Cole said nothing. He just handed him the clipboard. Kane scanned it. No reaction, no sigh, just a stillness. Then he asked, "How's morale?" Cole almost laughed. "Morale?" He gestured toward the tents, the stretchers, the dead. Kane didn't flinch. "I asked about morale, not casualties," he repeated. Cole hesitated, then answered honestly. "They're proud, but they're tired. They did something nobody thought was possible, and they know it." Kane gave a short nod. "Good," he said. "Then we did our job." Later that night, Jack sat by a fire, surrounded by men who should have died, and men who came a hair's breadth from it. Someone passed around a flask. Someone else started humming an old hymn. Jack opened his journal and started to write. Not about the battle, not about the strategy, but about a moment. "I saw a man today, a German. He dropped his rifle, put his hands up, and just started to weep. Not from fear, but from relief. We spared him, and I realized something. War isn't just about the killing. Sometimes it's about knowing when to stop." At the other end of the camp, Kane stood at the edge of the ridge, looking down into the valley where the battle had raged. His greatcoat flapped in the wind. In his hand, he held a letter, unopened. He'd been carrying it since before the fighting started. It was from his daughter, back home. He didn't read it. Not yet. Instead, he whispered, so low it was almost lost to the wind. Someday, they'll call this madness, and they'll be right. A pause. But it worked. Then he turned and walked back toward the tents. War teaches in the quiet. Not in the lectures, not in the orders shouted across fields, but in the long pause after the last shot is fired, when the smoke clears and you're left to count who's still standing. The battle for the Whisperwoods never made the big headlines. It wasn't part of some grand offensive. It wasn't planned by the Supreme Commander or mapped out in staff meetings for weeks. It was a trap, built not on superiority, but on patience, discipline, and faith. And it worked, because one man was willing to look like a fool. General Robert Kane knew what the textbook said. He knew what his peers would think. He knew that a retreat looks like weakness, that giving ground invites criticism, that they don't build monuments to generals who cede territory. But he knew something else too. Sometimes in war, as in life, the smartest move is the one that looks the dumbest. Let the enemy chase you. Let them get confident. Let them get close. And then take everything from them. The Whisperwoods taught more than tactics. It taught that morale isn't built on easy victories, but on earned survival. It taught that silence can be louder than 1,000 bullets. It taught that madness, in the right hands, is just another word for a vision others can't see. And it reminded everyone who passed through that forest, American or German, that the line between a retreat and a trap is as thin as a razor's edge. Sergeant Jack Thorne never saw General Kane again after the Whisperwoods. The old man faded from the headlines as quickly as he had appeared. No medals, no interviews, just a footnote in a classified report, buried under bigger battles with bigger names. But to Jack, and to every man who fought in that forest, Kane was the man who changed everything, because he taught them that strength isn't always about moving forward. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to step back, just far enough to make the enemy overreach. Jack carried that lesson with him for the rest of his life, not just in the war, but in everything that came after. In the moments when fear disguised itself as wisdom, in the times when silence said more than shouting ever could, and years later, when he had children of his own, he would tell them, "The bravest man I ever knew didn't lead a charge. He let the enemy come to him, and when they got there, he made them wish they hadn't." Now, let me ask you, have you ever been told that taking a step back is a weakness? That to retreat is to give up?